We left off last time getting the general structure of our grid in place. We discussed, how grids work with the lazy V grid, how you have to define columns. We got that in place. Now let's put in like our real data that's called mock data. You get it. So rather than like hard coding all of these. So let's actually, we'll keep one because we're going to need that. So anytime you want to kind of iterate through an array to populate a list, a grid, sometimes even a VStack or an HStack, what you're going to use in SwiftUI is something called for each. And like I said, this will iterate through your array and create each view accordingly. So when we initialize the for each here, you can see it takes in data and content. And here we use this initializer because this means our data doesn't have to have that data parameter name, right? So for our data, again, if we go to our framework here, right, we can see we're going to have mockdata.frameworks, and that's going to be this array of all this mock data that I gave you. So back to this. So we'll do framework. No, my bad. Mockdata.frameworks. There we go. So now ID, when SwiftUI is iterating through all this data, each one has to be uniquely identifiable for SwiftUI to know what to change, like if you're adding or deleting objects. So for right now, \.self, right, because this will basically take the object out of framework and hash it and give it its own kind of identifier. Let's dive into that real quick because that may have been very confusing. But again, back to these kind of autocomplete things. I like to do this and then just open and close braces afterwards. And Command C, Command V, get our framework in the for each, right? Not separately. So there you go. Now let's do a Command B. We should get an error. And as you can see, cannot convert value of type void to framework title view. So what I forgot to put here is as it's iterating through this, and this is very similar to like a for loop that you may be used to, you need to like have a name for each item. Well, you could do underscore to not have a name, but we want a name. We want to do framework is what we're going to name each of our elements and then in, right? Just again, kind of like you're iterating through this. So now what that does for me is that as I'm iterating through, instead of hard coding app clips, right, I can do framework name. Again, this is kind of similar, to a for loop that you may be used to in UIKit. So framework.image name, right? So that's what I'm doing. I'm using this framework to get the values I need from each framework as we iterate through that. Now, it's not working because I'm missing a very key point here. It says generic struct for each requires that framework conform to hashable. Okay, so let's go to our framework object. And the reason it needs to hash the object is because, like I said, it needs to give it like a unique identifier. And we're saying just, hey, the ID should just be self. Now doing something like self is fine when you have like maybe an array of integers, but when you have a custom object like we do in our framework, it's best to, you have to conform to hashable like this. And then you're going to get automatic hashable conformance because when you use, the foundation types here of like string, int, double, because those all automatically conform to hashable. If you have more custom types in here, you might have to write your own hashable conformance. But what I want to do to make this like super clear here, and this is what you should do when you have custom objects like our framework, is also conform to identifiable. Now you're going to see here, Command B, type framework does not conform to protocol identifiable. All it needs to conform to identifiable is an ID. So I can click this, hit protocol stubs. We're not going to do the object identifier. I guess this is kind of the same thing. This is what I always do. Var ID equals just to initialize a new UUID. And we'll actually make this a let because we're not changing it here, make it a constant. So here, we gave framework an ID, and it's going to initialize a new UUID every time, and that's going to be the unique identifier for this object when it's in like, for loops and such. So now back to our grid view. Now, instead of ID being keypath.self, it's going to be keypath.id. And what that ID is, again, back to framework, the property ID. So that's how the for each is going to identify the object. Now, the nice thing about SwiftUI, if we want to clean this up a little more, is when you conform to identifiable, like we just did, you can keep this here, this ID, but SwiftUI is already going to know because this object conforms to identifiable, I'm going to identify that object by its ID. So this code is kind of redundant. So if you want to clean up your code a little bit, conform your objects to identifiable, and then now you can delete that, and SwiftUI is going to know to look for the ID. That way your for each is a little bit cleaner, right? For each, our array of frameworks, and then the variable name for each framework as it iterates through. So now by running this, I should see like 16 app clips. No? What am I missing? Let's try it again. Sometimes previews, there we go. Again, previews can be a little finicky, like I just said, but I said 16 app clips, but that's a lie because I forgot we actually passed in the framework.name, framework.image name. So you can see our grid is, let's click off here so all those red squares aren't cluttering everything up. Our grid is kind of taking shape. It's not exactly how we want it, of course, but you're starting to see this come together. But now that we have this framework here, like I mentioned before, let's take the time to clean up our framework title view. So if we go down to framework title view here, right? We don't want to pass in an image name and a name separately, right? It's all part of the same framework. So what we can pass in here is say, let framework of type framework, right? So that's all we're going to pass in. And then now we got to change our names here, right? So we got to do framework.image name and framework.name. Do Command B to make sure everything is copacetic. Build failed. What do we do? Oh yeah, we haven't fixed this yet. So yeah, now our framework title view just takes in a framework. Like we've kind of done this before here. So now we can do framework, and then we're going to pass in this framework again as it's iterating through the for each. It's iterating through our array. We're going to pass in each framework into the framework title view to populate that. So again, now our grid is actually very clean, right? We pass in our columns. Cool. Our for each, again, like I said, the array, each framework, build a framework title view with the framework. Pretty straightforward. So if I pull up the design real quick, you're going to see it doesn't quite look like what we have. Well, one, it's not in dark mode. Like, what are we, psychopaths? Let's go back to our preview here. If you click this icon here, we can change the, what our preview looks like, right? If you want to change the device, the layout, we're going to change the color scheme, right? And also below this, you can check dynamic type, right? If you want to test what your app looks like. So this little environment overrides is a great place to test your app on the fly in the preview. We're going to keep it simple just now, change it to dark mode because we're not psychopaths. And you see what it did to our preview here, right? Here's our preview struct. Well, we used to have just framework grid view, but now we added a preferred color scheme .dark. So if you wanted to convert to dark mode just by typing that line of code, you can, or you can go to the environment overrides and change stuff here, right? So now we're testing this in dark mode now. Let's add our navigation view to get our nice looking Apple Frameworks navigation title. Okay, so here in our body, which again is only a couple lines of code. Again, the goal isn't to get to the minimum lines of code. It's for maximum understanding. Like I'm going to kind of pound that into your head. But I feel like even though this is only a couple lines of code, very understandable, at least in my opinion. Of course, that is very subjective. I get that. Okay, so let's wrap this whole thing in a navigation view, right? So the navigation view, if you're coming from UIKit, which I think a lot of you are, is basically a navigation controller. Right? So that's all we did to add a navigation controller, right? And if you remember how navigation controllers work, they hold an array of view controllers. I'm speaking UIKit terms right now, right? The navigation controller itself doesn't have a specific title like the Apple frameworks that you see in the design, right? As you're swiping through a navigation controller, that navigation title is going to change based on what screen is showing. So this threw me off at first, right? So when I want to add this navigation title in SwiftUI back to our code, I thought, hey, here's my navigation view. Cool. Let me add navigation title, and we'll do, I like to add the emojis here. Apple frameworks. So when I wanted to add the navigation title, I tried to add it to my navigation view, thinking, hey, that makes sense, right? That's logical. But again, if you think about that UIKit example I gave you, it's the content in the navigation view that has to know what title to show. So that's why you put the navigation title on we're going to put it on our grid here. Eventually we'll put it on something else, but right now our grid is the top level view in our navigation view, as you can see. So that's not the desired outcome, obviously, or is it? I don't know. What's your style? Who knows? So we need to put our lazy V grid in a scroll view. Now, if you've ever built a scroll view in Storyboard or Programmatic was a little easier than Storyboard, but building a scroll view in Storyboard is a nightmare. Watch how easy it is in SwiftUI. I'm going to type scroll view, open and close braces, and then we're going to copy or cut the grid, put it into the scroll view, and by doing that, we're leaving our navigation title on the scroll view. Real quick tip, if you want to see what is on something, this was introduced a couple of Xcode versions ago, but using your arrow keys, just arrow left and right over a brace, and it'll show like what you can see this flashing yellow light. That means that brace is the scroll view, and if I go up to this curly brace, oh, that's my V grid. If I go up to this one, okay, cool, that's my for each. Because sometimes SwiftUI curly braces can get out of control, so that's a nice way to see like what's what. So that way you can tell our navigation title is on frameworks. We put our lazy V grid in a scroll view, which all of that is inside our navigation view. Hope that made sense. But now when I run this here on the preview, now we get the scrolling action that we expect. And you can see the navigation title. You see it went up smaller at the top. We get that nice blurry effect up there with all of our frameworks. So just like that, and only a few lines of code. One last little tweak, and this is just personal preference, but I feel like our frameworks are pretty cramped, right? It's cramped up at the top here. It's cramped all the way, look at SF Symbols. It's cramped all the way here to the left of the screen. So what we can do here is in our framework title view, right? So each individual framework is going to get this padding, right? So on the VStack of our framework title view, let's add dot padding. And then if you see what that did, that just spaced things out, gave it more room to breathe. In my opinion, that's a nice cleaner look. This is totally subjective though. Here, real quick, watch the preview. I'm just going to comment out the code real quick. This is with padding. That's without padding. With padding. Without padding. But it's cool how you can play around with like looks like that in SwiftUI, literally in like seconds. So let's put the padding back in there because I like that. So our grid is built nicely. And then again, the cool thing is like, here's the code for our grid, you know? And again, I try not to brag about, look how little lines of code it is, but this is a case where it's nice and readable, easy to understand what's going on. Now, the challenge I'm going to leave you with at the end of this video is to try to build our detail view, a whole separate screen, as you can see in the designs, right? We tap on a framework and the detail view slides up. Now, I'm not asking you to pass the data, connect everything. No, we're going to do all that in a future video. All I want to see if you can do is to just build the UI structure of the screen. And I'll give you a hint, it's just a VStack. So nothing, all these challenges, I'm not trying to be like too crazy if you haven't noticed that yet. Again, I want to get you practicing, building these skills. But in the next video, we're going to build that screen together. But if you want to take a shot at it on your own, go for it. All right, see you in a bit.